This time on The Learning Hack, we're looking at learning systems. Welcome to the machine. Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool.
People have been trying to systematize, mechanize, and automate learning for well over 100 years. But learntech, as we know and love it, only really became a serious industry with the dawn of the 21st century. And when that happened, all hell broke loose. The people who really know what learning is about, both in theory and in practice, the experts who made up what some call the guru community, were not at all on board with the products that this industry was putting out. The SCORM-based e-learning systems that dominated the market were too rigid in design, they said, too admin-focused, too mechanical. The industry listened, and it's changed over the years. But are we really in a place yet where learning systems can be judged truly fit for purpose? My guest on The Learning Hack this time is someone I felt might be able to answer that question. Tell us about her, Kate.
Hack facts.
Page Chen is CEO of Remote Learner, which recently joined the Learning Pool Group. The company is based in Colorado and Ontario, Canada, but even before the pandemic struck was already operating completely remotely.
Hence the name.
Page has a master's degree in adult education and a PhD in instructional design for online learning.
With that academic background, I felt Dr. Chen was well placed to know whether learning systems were really now smart and flexible enough to do the thing they were always supposed to do in the first place, to help people learn stuff. Jay Curtis, Head of Themes, what did we cover in our chat?
Hi John. Discussion pointed out one major area where learntech and academic theory were not aligned during the first decade of the century. Too much separation of content from platform, with the result that the platform became just a delivery vessel, in Page's words. You also covered how data is playing an increasing role, how to strike a balance between learner support and learner autonomy, and how the adaptive AI-driven future of learning systems is likely to impact L&D.
Thanks, Jay. The biggest takeout for me was that thing about how the old school LMS was just a delivery vessel, and how learning design nowadays happens not just within the narrow confines of the course, but across the whole learning system. And if you're wondering what I'm waffling on about, don't worry, Page makes it very clear. It's an interesting conversation. Give it a listen. So, welcome to The Learning Hack, Dr. Chen. I hope you're right if I call you Page.
Yes, please.
You're CEO of Remote Learner, well, you know that, one of the USA's leading digital learning companies. But unusually, perhaps, for somebody in that position and role, you've got a strong academic background with a master's in adult education, PhD in instructional design for online learning. Can I ask you, did it feel like a natural progression for you to go from one to the other, or was there serendipity or even accident in the way that happened? What was your journey? I ask this because it's an emerging industry, so the backstory of people, how they got into digital learning, is always interesting because it's never quite straight path.
I think the honest answer is it was absolutely accidental. I have my career started kind of focusing always on that transitional period between university and career. So I started working in community colleges down in South Florida, sort of what was called the old tech prep program and the Carl Perkins funding in the United States to really support people in that transition, or high school students looking to transition into skilled-based careers. So I think that even in my academic background, it was always with that kind of foot in academics and foot in workplace development type of space. And then from there, we moved around a lot. I'm a military wife, so by default, your husband's career takes precedent on locations where you live. And very often in a traditional academic setting, there's a tenure process where you have to be someplace long enough to sort of earn your credits inside of an organization. And when you're moving every 2 to 3 years, it's hard to be someplace for too long. In today's remote workforce, that's very possible. So I started looking into what are ways that my career could stay on a growth path and was not location dependent. And that really led me into the online learning and training space. Started working in aerospace and oil and gas and building training programs within those industries. And then in my PhD program, I met a lovely young lady who at that time was the CFO of a little company called Remote Learner. And I got recruited into Remote Learner a little over 11 years ago and started working for them. And where I lived didn't matter. Remote Learner as a company has always been a completely distributed workforce. So even in today's global pandemic work from home world, this has always been the way Remote Learner staff has functioned in a very kind of remote working environment. So it's been sort of that natural evolution of where I wanted to go with my career, but I had these wonderful academic roots. And Remote Learner's story is much the same. Remote Learner started in a very academic world as one of the first Moodle partners. Very focused on providing online environments for university settings and just educational institutions in general. And as the industry has evolved, as technology has evolved, more and more you saw corporate organizations looking for unique features. And we had wonderful developers where we could go in and modify the open source code environment. And it really sort of followed that same track. And you started looking at what are the needs within that corporate space. And it made for this wonderful blend, different than many of your more traditional corporate training platforms that are very SCORM focused. And here's your SCORM content and it's all contained and, click next and get to the end type of a situation. The team at Remote Learner was still very academic minded. So we brought a lot of those instructional strategies into the corporate training environment. So we brought those same lessons and forums and assignments and a lot of that very traditional approach and blended it very nicely with the different corporate training objectives. So it's made for a very unique niche for even our approach to corporate training.
Right. So coming into this industry where you have learning management systems, SCORM content, and a whole rather rigid model for e-learning that perhaps owes more to sort of business process engineering than it does to the academic roots of online learning. How much did you find that it was in step with what you'd studied academically and knew about adult learning? And where did you see there was conflict? So I'm talking about the early years now, sort of around 2000 onwards, when the model for the online the learning technologies industry first kind of consolidated and was really set down.
I think for me, because of the military involvement, I really came out of more of the old instructional systems design, which is a very rigid approach to instructional design, instructional strategy, which really aligned closely to the corporate objectives and more of that corporate compliance space, especially working in aerospace and with the U.S. Air Force. So for me, my own academic roots, when I look at true adult learning theory, there was a conflict in that the direct instruction versus the learner brings something to the table. In a true compliance world, you're not worried about, traditionally, you're not worried about what that adult brings to the conversation. You're only worried about what you are required to tell them to get through to the end of that training experience. And I think it's been a nice evolution. And I think that's where we're seeing so much of where the platform is evolving too, is embracing more than the direct instruction and evolving into that social learning, which frankly, many platforms, and you look at even the history of the Moodle platform itself, going back, 15, almost 20 years ago, was truly based on that social collaborative constructivist-based learning concept about adults coming together and learning together, which I think is, quite frankly, why so many corporations have been attracted even to a Moodle platform, because of that base concept that put in versus your traditional SCORM environment.
Almost as soon as that model was sort of consolidated and laid down in 2000 onwards, which, as you say, is very close to the direct instruction, slightly military way of training people. From then onwards, there was this whole guru community at conferences on blogs telling the learntech industry where they were going wrong, as in, your stuff doesn't support informal learning, doesn't support collaborative learning, 70-20-10, self-directed, so on and so on. And my impression at the time was that innovation in learntech was somewhat on its back foot, responding to each successive new attack, if you're going to kind of phrase it in that way. And sometimes the debate was really quite competitive. It's a subjective opinion, I could be wrong. During those years, I was mainly kind of a marketing manager, coming to trade shows, setting up booths, as you'd call them. And every year, it seems, you turned up, there'd be a new load of guru opinion that everybody had to respond to. And as marketing manager, my job was to put the words on the collateral and on the kind of backings to the stand. And I had to listen to what they said and respond to it. So it seemed to me like an industry on its back foot. Contrast that with sort of like in the same years, Facebook, Google were kind of coming up with this stuff, and we'd look at it and start using it enthusiastically and thinking all the time, well, this changes everything, and trying to respond to the innovation they were laying down. Didn't feel like that in learntech. It felt really quite on the back foot. But what's your take on the way that the technology developed during those years, first couple of decades of the century?
I think it kind of plateaued for a very long time. It created a functional tool, and then the thought was that the land for online was to be this separate engagement of delivery, and not looking at that relationship that's being built. In my own research, one of the things that I really focused on is looking at the apps, e-commerce platforms, the Facebook and different social media, and really tried to examine why is it that we, as adults and even as young people, will happily sit in front of a computer and spend hours on Facebook or crush candy in a game or play solitaire and engage in all these other ways. But when it came to our online learning platforms, we treated it like accounting software from the 90s still. And there was no relationship that was being built. And there was a lot that was trying to be done to create a learner to learner engagement, or a lot that's trying to be done, even, learner through instructor or trainer engagement. But I think where these other media platforms really were successful was in the platform itself becoming a social actor in that experience and in that exchange. And that's one of the things that I think we're really seeing now as an industry, and really acknowledging the role that the platform needs to play, other than just being a vessel to deliver the instruction. And that's really where that data layer comes in, because then you're able to create that automation where the platform can respond to that user's inputs. And it creates a very personalized experience that's appropriate to the user as they're going through that path. And I think that's, once we embraced giving permission that the platform could play a role, I think that's when we saw a big pivot as an industry, in acknowledging that we could use the data to enhance the experience versus just collect the data to analyze later.
Before we get completely up to date, to sort of delve back a bit further into the prehistory of learning systems, if you like. I've been looking at the early years of those learning systems, specifically Plato in the 60s and 70s. And one of the things that struck me about how differently things turned out from the way they were back then in the years when academic research largely dominated innovation was how separated content and platform became subsequently. I know every company in e-learning always says they do everything, but in practice you had rather different types of companies developing content from the type of companies that developed systems and not learning management systems and so on. And each of these two camps, if you like, seem to have their own agenda.
Mm-hmm.
However, when I heard you speaking on the e-learning podcast recently, it was like you were moving very fluidly from one to another, from content to platform, in explaining how to create a learning experience. Is it that we've finally arrived at a place where the systems and the content are really working together properly at last? In other words, we've nailed it. Or is it more that we're really at the beginning of doing it in a more intelligent way that's kind of more in line with theory?
I think as an industry, we know how to nail it. I think we have the tools. Where I think the struggle comes in is the sustained, really scalable ability to apply the strategy of getting it right. So I think there are many organizations, I'd like to believe, we are one of them, Remote Learner and our colleagues at Learning Pool, who get it right, who understand the importance of those layers coming together in order to create that experience. And it really comes down to knowing who that learner is and applying an accurate and correct experience for them, and using the tool to do it. I think when we look at the different ways that content can be created, so often what we saw in true instructional design was you start with, what are the objectives, and then you go backwards, and then what is the test, right? What am I going to ask? What are the questions I'm going to need them to be able to answer? And then what content do I have to give them to deliver that? And you created this very with the end in mind content experience of what is that story you wanted to tell. And then as instructional designers, we would then go look for the tool to deliver it, right? But you started with the content in mind. And I think so often what we've seen with the technology platforms is it was focused with what are the best ways to deliver it, regardless of what I'm teaching, regardless of what the instructional objectives are, what is the best way to deliver it? And then we were trying to mush those two things together. I think the maturity as an industry is we understand it's about really weaving that into a single process. You need to know the functionality of the tool in order to design the content to work and engage within it in ways that are enhancing that learning experience, capturing, quite frankly, the data that you're looking to have, and then providing that information back to the user throughout that experience. And I think it's that full circle. At Learning Pool, we like to kind of talk about, you've got the data layer and the content layer and the experience layer, and you have to think about all of them, and not one of them could or should stand alone. And that once you get those three layers working in harmony, I think that's where, as an industry, we're finally getting it right and we're nailing it.
Yeah. Is there still a kind of tension in that you have these big content libraries? Part of the thing of the original e-learning model was that, your content's separate, it's provided by these third-party companies. And basically you had a face-to-face course, now you have an online course. It's a kind of integral unit, but that kind of imposes a model that's a bit one and done. In other words, once you've done the course, got to the end, taken the quiz, you're trained, that's it. Whereas kind of what we know about learning is that it takes time, it's more about spaced practice. You'll want to kind of go back to things again and again. And at different stages of the process, there are different things you need to do, and you can't necessarily cover all that within a kind of hour-long e-learning module.
I agree. And
is
I will
that
tell
still
you,
slightly baked into the industry, if you know?
absolutely baked into the industry. And you see that with the popularity of so many of these content aggregators that are out there, which, you can buy access to a library and you suddenly have a corporate training solution.
Yeah.
And then I will tell you, I personally have never subscribed to that. And that's not been something that at Remote Learner we've done a whole lot of. We've always done very much more of a bespoke content approach to what we bring for our clients at Remote Learner. And then we will, introduce them to content libraries and sort of bring that into the fold. But it's because that approach, that much more academic-minded philosophy that we brought into bear, really did look at that larger long-term space. So one of the designs that we use very often, we call it PAR, and it's an acronym, probably poorly spelled, but it's PPARR. So it is prepare. So that's your direct instruction. It's practice, give them a safe place to fail. But then usually we work with our clients to build in sort of an act or apply. So maybe that's where there'll be a test if it's the requirement of that, or we say go apply it in the job, and your manager has to see you doing the thing that you just went through a practice on. And then it requires a supervisor to come in and actually acknowledge that they've seen that training, that behavior, that skill demonstrated. And then we go into either a review, if it was some sort of skill-based thing, or reflection. How did it go? You practice, your listening skills. You actually applied it. How did that experience go? And we really try to break it up and really look at what is that transition into the working environment in building that out and following that model. And there's always different variations on the theme. We've really tried to take that concept, not just of a traditional blended approach, but literally blending it into, as people like to say, blending it into the flow of work, but for more of that instructional experience.
You are data.
You are data. You are data. You are data.
Every pulse of your heart, every step you take, the place you travel to, the thing that gets your attention, it all leaves a trace in data. And the world reconfigures itself around you, moment to moment, based on that data.
You are data. You are data.
Data has learned a lot about you over the years. Isn't it time you learned more about data?
You are data. You are data. You are data. You are data.
Data is a hot topic in learning right now, perhaps the hottest. But when you look at what's happened historically with learning analytics, it's hard to deny that it's been a little bit stuck. Stuck in the first two levels of Kirkpatrick. Stuck in what David Wilson and Charles Jennings have called the conspiracy of convenience. Stuck in a lack of capability, money, and time to evaluate. So how can we get ourselves out of this endless Mobius loop of wanting to do it all, but ending up not actually doing very much? I've talked to a lot of experts and practitioners, and the result is a whole series of guides and resources that Learning Pool will be releasing to help you map your way out of that loop. Download the first of these now. The Data and Learning White Paper.
You are data. You are data. You are data.
One of the things that's been really nice in where the industry is going is really allowing more of those micro training elements to then also get blended into the flow of work. And I think that's been a really big pivot in the industry, is that willingness to have those searchable micro training concepts be applied to that just-in-time training, right? I'm dating myself with terms like that, going backwards in the industry. But I think that is what's evolving and kind of where the industry is going versus the old school, go sit in ballroom B for 8 hours. And if you can check a box that you stayed there through lunch, then you get credit for training. So I think we've seen this whiplash as an industry where we thought, oh, we don't have to have them sit in ballroom B, but we're going to make them, we're going to lock down their computer and we're going to not let them fast forward, and they have to sit and watch everything, and they have to prove that they sat there for 90 minutes. Whether they got up to make a sandwich or not, we don't know, but we forced them to sit there for 90 minutes in their computer, and that means they're trained. And that's just not an appropriate return on investment for corporations. You have to actually see how it is improving their world and improving the actual job performance in the workplace.
So you mentioned data a bit earlier. What's the role of data in all this now? Some people say that we've been too constrained in L&D by our proprietary silo-specific models and standards like SCORM and Kirkpatrick and so on. Is it time to break down those silo walls a bit, do you think, so that there can be a useful interaction of data and learning platforms?
Yes. Did I elaborate?
Damn, I've done it again. I've asked a question that you can give a one-word answer to. Would you like to elaborate on that?
I think absolutely. I think there is all sorts of valid and appropriate reasons when we think about, data privacy and kind of what we do within that space. But then there's also that integrity of letting people know that you're doing it, and that willingness. So we see this in social media where suddenly we all woke up and we said, oh, what do you mean you've been tracking what I look at, and now you're showing me ads based on what I'm interested in? How horrible. Well, when you thought they were just showing you ads and you happened to be interested in them, you weren't upset about it. But as soon as you thought your data was being used against you, people had this visceral reaction. And then in looking at the different studies, that reaction was generationally different. So you have an older generation where we're all like, it's our own private business. Why does anyone want to see a picture of my lunch? And everybody kind of gets very private, because that's how, for so many of us, we were raised. Our information was our own private commodity. You look at the younger generation, teenagers, kids in their 20s and even 30s, and they want the benefit of someone knowing their information. They want that, whether it is that adoration, they want that adrenaline rush, or they want the convenience of, I'm walking down the street and my phone says, oh, you're on 5th Street. There's a restaurant around the corner that's having your favorite sandwich on sale today. They're glad that the system told them that. You bring that into an academic setting, and suddenly we have a different ethical responsibility. And there was so much of a thought process about what do we do with the data and how do we use it, which is so backwards to me, because as a researcher, we've been looking at people's data for a very long time. That's what research is about. And especially when we look at, things around behavioral sciences, and you're tracking user behavior and learner behavior, and you're using it for research purposes, we all feel, very noble, and aren't we doing a great thing? But then as soon as we put it into a piece of technology, we feel like we're giving over control of that data experience. But young people are okay with it. And I think generationally that is changing over time. And even as a society, we're becoming more and more okay within reason. One of the strategies that we talk about in our organization is what we look at, something called persuasive design strategies. And one of the strategies is literally called surveillance. And that comes out of the work of BJ Fogg and what he looked at with persuasive technology. And surveillance is a very provocative term. It makes everybody kind of reel back. And what do you mean you're surveilling me? It feels very, cloak and dagger. But the reality is it's only creepy if you're not telling the user that you're doing it. If you're disclosing it and then giving that data back to them so that they can be informed about their own behavior or where they sit with one another, where they sit within the whole. And that's why, quite frankly, as an industry, we've seen such benefit from the gamification movement, which really is just about, we collected data and we told you. provided it back to you as the user. And then, yes, there are strategies about what you provide and when in order to trigger the particular behaviors you're trying to inspire. But it becomes to their benefit. And we're really seeing that enter into the online learning environment and an openness to it. We talk about the concept of suggestion as a strategy. And like if Amazon was building an e-learning platform, would they say, people who struggled with this skill benefited from watching this video, right? So they're able to look at that user's behavior or what they're struggling with or where they're not showing mastery and provide other recommendations and suggestions of ways to close that knowledge gap. That's about using the data to benefit that learning experience and influence that engagement. And it goes back full circle. That's data where the platform is now that social actor, and the platform is collecting information, and then it's using the intelligence that us as designers and programmers told it to use and being able to deliver that back.
You talk about giving learners choices within persuasive design. Where for you is the point of balance between learners being supported, having scaffolding, if you like, going along a carefully structured path, balance between that and being more autonomous and self-directed learner? And is your view of that informed by your background in studying adult education? So 2 questions for the price of 1.
So I like them both, and I think they both play a role. Funneling is one of the first strategies that we're taught in any educational training, where you're guiding that learner step by step, and they have to do things in a very sequential order, and you're building skills. And there's a reason for taking people down a particular path when you're laying that foundation. At some point in any type of learning experience, you have to start allowing that learner to branch off and explore and go down those paths that are of interest to them because of how they're going to apply what you're teaching, or scenario-based, how they're going to explore their relationship with the information, or just their general curiosity. So I think it's about choosing the right strategy based on what you're trying to teach and at what phase within that process that learner is in. And I think we see that, very often there'll be that launch off course. Everybody must do the prerequisites. But from there, in an academic setting, then you can pick your electives. How do you want to fill in your journey? And I think there's a lot of power to that. And many LMSs do this, where you can build a program and there are certain required courses, and then you can, pick 3 of the 5, and sort of started seeing that in the LMS space and allowing that exploration. And one of the things that when I talk to people about, using the strategy of choice is don't provide any choices that you don't want someone to take. So if you give them 3 choices and you're like, gee, I really hope they don't pick the second one because that would just blow it all. Don't do that. If you want to give them 3 choices, give them 3 choices where you're okay with any of the options that they pick to go down that path. And when we think about that when we look at, different systems where you say, here's 700 courses. We hope you pick the good ones. Well, only put in the good ones. Just provide the information where any choice that they make, you feel confident as an L&D professional or as an organization that you're okay with them wandering through that. And I think that's the balance, is if you open it up too much, when it is in a training setting, it is possible for them to go down a rabbit hole you don't want them to go down.
It feels to me like you feel that it is possible to design a system, a general system, where that point of balance is defined in the right place. But I have had conversations with platform owners and the technology people behind platforms where they say it's different within different organizations. So some organizations have a very directive training culture, and with them you'll want to provide maximum structure, but we need the flexibility within our system that if you go to, say, so you're going to kind of a groovy social media tech giant company, for instance, they will want something more autonomous learner, open-ended. So the fuel mixture varies from one organization to another. But do you think you can actually arrive at a kind of happy mean that would suit everybody that's instructionally sound, or do you need to allow organizations to change the balance in that way?
I think absolutely organizations have to change the balance to what's appropriate to their needs. And a tool platform, the technology can be designed in such a way to allow multiple strategies to be utilized for what is appropriate for that particular learning objectives or strategy that needs to come into play. If I'm training leadership, absolutely, people have different leadership styles, and they might want to explore and do scenarios and try on different leadership styles. If I'm training somebody around, PPE, the personal protection equipment, I want them to use the equipment in an exact way, a very specific skill to protect them. And I don't want them to explore different ways to wear the equipment that they might think is beneficial to them. No, this is how you need to do it. And this is a direct instruction, and there's a particular process that needs to come into play. And a platform that can adapt to when it does need to be a very structured, this is what you're being taught and why, and you need to understand the consequences of not doing it the way that you're being instructed. That is a strategy. And then in the exact same platform, you can also apply a strategy that says, I'm going to give you some basic guidelines of information, and then I want you to try on different styles. I want you to see what works, and I want you to collaborate with others. And then I want you to reflect on it at the end. I've never seen a reflection question after a safety training. How do you feel about being told how to be safe? Oh, this is what you need to do. And I think to try to say that as an industry we need to pick is, I don't know, that's ludicrous to me. That's like saying that I need to teach English the same way we teach math. If it's different, there's different objectives and there's different strategies. There's reasons that in academia, we have different applications and approaches that we take based on the content and the objectives. And in a corporate world, it should be no different.
So, Paige, when you look to the future and all the new adaptive AI technology that we can foresee coming into the design of learning systems, it's already there, but it's kind of limited in what it's doing at the moment. And we know that there are people out there working very hard on adaptive systems. Is there a danger that it becomes a black box for the average L&D professional, i.e. that learning experience design gets sort of centralized within the technical architecture of the system itself, and so becomes beyond the skill set because they can't kind of look into the code or whatever? And if so, is the answer a lot of frantic upskilling for L&D, or really should it be the onus on the vendors to provide more trainer-friendly system design? How do you see that future panning out?
It's been such an interesting journey for me in my career. I think back to when I first got started in this space, and you couldn't go to the Indeed.coms of the world and search for instructional designer as a job. It didn't exist. It wasn't a thing. And even when I was in my graduate studies, studying studying adult education for online learning was the way that the degree was written, because there wasn't a concept about what do you need to know to build online instruction. I look at where we fast forwarded as an industry now, and you look at the job descriptions for people in L&D or specifically in instructional design, and it still varies greatly between, are you looking for somebody who knows how to write a good question and learning objectives and design content? Or are you looking for somebody who knows how to build inside of Storyline and they're a wizard at using adapt tools and in order to create online content? Or are we moving further into what is the strategy of using the tools within that space? And we've seen such an arc of where having that deeper understanding of the technology comes into play. And I think to directly answer your question, as an industry, we have to stay more cutting edge as far as those L&D professionals in understanding the tools. But I think as a technology company, I think we also have to understand not everybody is going to go out and learn code. Not everybody is going to say, I want to build content, so I'm going to go teach myself CSS because I want to make it look a certain way. So we have to build in tools that allow for the strategy that those L&D professionals would like to have be a part of their system, be applied. And I think there's different ways to do that in what is more of a kind of a manual way. So creating choice. So you can, we do things with our clients where we'll say, okay, in this particular section, show learners the next course that they need to take, as long as it is in the category that they're supposed to take it in, and that unless they haven't finished something else, then show them that, right? There's boxes that they can check. So they're not writing an algorithm. They're just, it's a very simple UI for them as an admin and be able to check. Now that just created a very personalized, adapted experience to the learner. But really it's just a bunch of filters, right? It's a bunch of filters and then what are you displaying back again? But if you do that through tagging and through, enough information that we're capturing about the learner and just kind of what is their completions as they're moving through the system, you can create a very adaptive environment that instructor can, or that site admin can sort of manipulate in ways that's simple to do. When we start to look into where it can go in much larger recommendation type of situations, where you're looking at a more collective world, we're getting into more of the algorithm-based environment, that's where you need to have that relationship and that trust between you as a site admin, understanding the choices that you have, and then understanding the algorithms that are there driving that engine. I don't think it means by any stretch that as L&D professionals, the expectation is to go and learn more about code or writing algorithms, but it's about understanding the role of the platform and quite frankly, acknowledging that the platform will become a social actor in that experience. And you're turning over a little bit of that control. As a classroom teacher, you want to make sure you know what's going on, you keep a tight schedule, everything is under control. And I think more and more that as L&D professionals, you're being asked to turn over what feels like some of that control to the platform. Then the goal has to be around understanding the technology, not becoming a developer, not needing to go and code it yourself, but having that understanding and trust that as a technology, it was built with the right ethical goals in mind.
Page, Dr. Chen, thank you very much for taking the time today.
Thank you.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to Page and to our sponsors, Learning Pool. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. Please subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
If you've stayed with us this far, we've already presumed on your good offices too much, but I want to ask you one more favour. Give us some feedback. What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? You can tweet me at John Helmer or reach me through my website, johnhelmerconsulting.com.
Coming up on the Learning Hack,
Still, we have guests for you. Donald Clark is back in full rebarbative form. We have the amazing Mirjam Neelan and the 70-20-10 man, Charles Jennings.
Stay classy, learning people.
Now I finally get it.
People can go and ride a roller coaster, right? I took my kids to Coney Island and I'm going to show them this great big wonderful roller coaster that they have there. And we get there and they ride this roller coaster and then we're done. And no one ever wants to go back again. They rode the one roller coaster and that was it. Now, as a family, we go to Disney World as often as we can get there. And there's roller coasters, but people buy season tickets to an amusement park. Not because of the one roller coaster, but because of the overall experience, because of the sights, the smells, the sounds. So what do we do? And we translate that into a learning experience. Are we building roller coasters? Are we building these one-off mega courses that once you're done, it's that one and done and no one comes back again? Or do we want to create training environments in our organizations that people want to buy a season ticket to? When you build a big, massive mega course, nobody knows how to go in and find in module 7 on day 4 that one little nugget that they needed. And that kind of goes back to what I had talked about with the movement that we're seeing towards those more of the micro courses that allow those little content elements to become searchable resources following a training.
What time of the day is it for you now? Is it?
We're just for 8 a.m.
Oh, right. Yeah. Breakfast time. Sorry.
Yep.
Get on with
my
your day.
coffee.
Yeah. Wow. That's a big cup of coffee.
It is. It's a big day.
When should I begin?
When you're ready.
Okay.